A very good evening and welcome to South Africa Today and Beyond. In studio this evening, I'm joined by Marije, who's from the Rural Health Advocacy Project. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Sure. Maybe tell us, for our viewers who have no idea what the Rural Advocacy Project is all about. What is the scope of your work? What are you guys advocating for?
Okay. The Rural Health Advocacy Project, we were established in 2009 by three organizations, Section 27, which used to be the AIDS Law Project, the Rural Doctors Association of Southern Africa, and Wits University Center for Rural Health. And our main goal is to put a spotlight on the state of healthcare in the rural areas and to be a connecting force between the developments in the rural areas in terms of access to healthcare services by communities, the working conditions of healthcare workers, and the decision makers and other stakeholders to ensure that sufficient funding, budgets, does flow to the rural areas, and also to ensure that policies, when they are developed, take into account the rural context. So, for instance, if we take this big new strategic objective of the national health insurance, ensuring that everyone access quality health care based on need and not based on ability to pay, how do we make such an important policy directive implementable in the rural areas, as we do not have a private sector presence in the rural areas, which we do have in the urban areas. And if you don't have organizations like ours and others that engage with those policy processes, we easily forget the rural context. Out of sight, out of mind, and a policy might have very good intentions, but ultimately doesn't achieve its goals for the rural communities. And that is sad because in 2017, the former homelands are still the most deprived parts of South Africa in terms of multi-level deprivation, access to education, levels of employment, health status, access to water and sanitation. And those are the areas that need more resources, but actually receive less. And that's what we call the inverse care law. And so we are one of those groups that try to create broader awareness of what is needed to get the rural areas at an equal level as the rest of the country, on the basis of equal citizenship and equal rights.
I think you're raising an important issue, Marije, and is the issue around context. And in terms of policy, and when you implement policy, you can't apply a blanket approach in terms of how health services are provided in urban areas versus how they're provided in rural areas. But what are some of the major challenges? And when you speak about this particular context, maybe just to get into that, when you talk about contextual health provision in the rural areas, what are some of the major challenges we're looking at in those areas?
I would say budgeting, access and human resources for health, and also participation in decision making. Let me try to unpack them. First of all, in order to deliver a service in the rural areas, it is going to be more expensive because there's a lower population density, which makes the price per patient in the public sector higher. So if we divide the budget only on the basis of the number of patients that the hospital is serving, the hospital actually ends up with less because the numbers are lower and it makes it more expensive per patient to deliver the same service. Also, maintenance of cars and the type of ambulances that you need in the rural areas. You need 4x4 ambulances in order to reach your hard-to-reach communities, which is all more expensive. Very practical challenges, like if you have to send your vehicles that health workers might use to travel to patients, to meetings, the ambulances, if you have to send them for service, you basically have to go to town and you have to wait for 2 weeks or a week for that vehicle to be returned. That is one area. So there's an added cost to achieve the same outcome. Then secondly, I would say the difference between access and reach. When we're talking about the constitutional right to access healthcare services, we often think about it at the point of care. So when community members, healthcare users reach a facility, they should be able to access primary healthcare services. But in the rural areas, we like talking about reach. The services need to reach the people in the rural areas. Because here, there's very high levels of employment. And for many community members that live on, survive on social grants, to access the healthcare service, it can be quite a distance of traveling. And once they get to the health facility, there's medicine stock out, or it's not the right day for vaccination and so on. Rather, let us also make sure that we follow up on those patients and reach them at the household level. Therefore, the new government policy of community health workers is so critical, especially for the rural areas, where we have very high levels of delayed health-seeking behavior because of the conditions, because of the high poverty levels, because of the financial and geographical difficulties of reaching facilities. We need people screening households, preventative. Have your children vaccinated? Have you tested for HIV? Your newborn baby, was he tested for HIV? And we know from research that vaccination levels in the rural areas are lower, much lower, below the national targets. And yeah, if we don't actively visit households, we will miss out on those patients and those communities. And lastly, of course, a very big challenge that we are faced with in the rural areas is to recruit and retain healthcare workers across the board. It's just not as popular to work in rural areas. It often takes a particular type of healthcare worker who is willing to serve where the need is the greatest and who's willing to live far from the cities. And currently, with our flatlining health budgets, due to the economic and political crisis, I think we can say there's less money available for health, and therefore there's less funding available to fill healthcare worker posts. And where a province only has a limited budget for vacant posts, the urban posts get filled first, because there might be some posts available in the rural areas, but few healthcare workers apply, and we often depend on foreign qualified doctors. But as you may have seen, currently we struggle to absorb interns, we struggle to absorb community service medical officers, and we try to absorb our own graduates into those vacant posts, but no one is applying. They're applying in the urban areas. So it's an extra disadvantage for the rural communities, and I think what is needed is really to change our education and our selection. Universities have started changing the selection criteria, but we believe, as the Rural Health Advocacy Project, if government is investing, if we talk about, for instance, medical officers, if government is investing about 800,000 of taxpayers' money in the training of doctors, then as society, it's unfair if the communities that need those doctors the most are not receiving those doctors. 50% goes to the private sector or overseas, and then 25 goes to, or more than 25 goes to urban public sector, and only a small minority ends up in the rural areas. And yeah.
Marije, in terms of legislation, how can we, even through the advocacy project, but also civil society organizations that are working within the health sector space and the advocacy on health issues, how can we, in terms of engaging government, in terms of ensuring that, if we are paying the bursaries that are there that go towards funding young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, to go and to work within the health space. Yeah. How can we ensure through legislation perhaps that young people, whoever, if government is paying for you to go to school to become a health practitioner, maybe for X amount of years, you must be in the public sector space and you must be doing work in the rural health sector space. Is that conversation there within the work that you guys are doing? Yeah.
So we do have percentage of graduates that have bursaries, that receive bursaries in order to give back to the communities where they are from. There are some challenges there, primarily lack of enforcement. So students have received a bursary, but the provincial departments of health are not actually enforcing the contract that the students have signed. Secondly, there's a lack of posts in the rural area. So same with the new health cadre that we have, the mid-level healthcare worker clinical associates that a number of universities are producing, those are trained to work in rural areas. It's this new cadre that is really part of the solution for South Africa, but there are very few posts in the rural areas. So here you have a new cadre that is conceptualized to help address the health workforce shortage in rural areas, but many struggle to find work and now start looking for private sector positions, which is very unfortunate.
That's quite unfortunate. I mean, and when you look at it, it's really discouraging. And the kind of health workers that are there as well, if you're placed in the rural communities as well, you also, even within the urban areas, I think to some extent, people complain about, the fact that there's so much work. They're understaffed. And at the same time, people are saying, but wait a minute, there aren't any posts advertised. There was a young woman on social media just, I think a couple of months ago, saying that, she's a qualified doctor and she isn't getting any placement. She's engaging the ministry, she's engaging the Provincial Department of Health in KZN, but she simply is not getting posted. But I think luckily she's a friend of mine on Facebook, but she's now found a job. But I'm saying that the kind of work and effort and the kind of fighting spirit she was demonstrating on social media, that she's really fighting. But this takes me also to, how do we protect health practitioners? And after the ad break, I want us to hone in on the discussion you guys had yesterday.
Okay.
Especially around how do we protect health practitioners? How do we ensure that they themselves become advocates for quality health services? Okay. Ensure they're not overworked, and the spaces that they work in. I mean, they're first and foremost, they are workers themselves, and they need that sort of protection. But of course, we'll then contextualize it within the Life is a Dimeni, tragedy that occurred, and how do health practitioners sound these alarm bells when they go off and say, but wait a minute, there's an issue here that needs to be, attended to. But let's go for a quick ad break, and when we return, we'll take the conversation further with Marije. Welcome back from the ad break, and in the studio I'm still joined by Marije, who's from the Rural Advocacy Health Project. Marije, before the ad break, we're talking about health practitioners and the fact that there's so many issues, especially within the rural space. But again, also, there is a need to protect, health workers and health practitioners. And I was saying earlier on, because, we want to have this conversation in light of the discussion you guys were having, the public debate you guys were having yesterday at the Wits University, the Department of School of Health, rather, and especially around the issue of life as a domain. How do health practitioners themselves become advocates, and begin to say that, one, there is a need for, a space in which where we can, safely protect it and say, but there are problems within the workspace we find ourselves in, and recognize that first and foremost, they are also workers. The quality of the work that's there, the quality of services that are provided to South Africans in general. What were some of the responses, I think, that came out of that particular conversation?
Okay, yeah. So yesterday we organized a public debate around the tragedy of Life is Sidimeni, and the approach that we took really was society is angry about what has happened to the 141, and I think it's still increasing number of patients that have died in under such inhumane and avoidable circumstances. And we feel that this cannot happen again. But as we talk, this is happening again, not in the same manner and not maybe on the same scale. But as I was saying earlier on, due to the budget austerity, we've got less posts. And when we have less posts, there's less services. And for instance, therapists, allied health professional posts are being cut in some provinces, and people with disabilities in the rural areas will no longer receive the services that they used to receive. So in order to say never again, healthcare workers need to feel confident and skilled to advocate when such injustices are preferably about to happen and not while they have already happened and when it's too late. But there are many barriers within the healthcare worker, him or herself, and within the system that avoid healthcare workers speaking out and raising the alarm. So that was what we were discussing last night. We had speakers from healthcare workers that worked with the patients of Life is Sidimeni, and we had civil society, activists, treatment action campaign, Section 27, and students that raised the alarm. And one of the some of the themes that came out is, first of all, this healthcare worker paralyzes, that healthcare workers don't know how to speak out. Either they think they don't have a right to speak out, or they don't feel like they should get involved. They should focus more on their medical duties. But globally we say, and there's this development that among the competencies that society expects of healthcare workers is to be an advocate for the patient. If you only focus on the medical component of the work, your patients can still suffer, and you are then part of the problem. And therefore, in South Africa, we do have, as part of the competency framework for medical doctors, the advocacy competency that needs to be developed. Universities must train healthcare workers in advocacy, but very few are currently doing so. And the nursing profession also has, as part of its oath, social justice components for patient rights. So that's a problem, and what we've seen with Life is CDMania is that there were some healthcare workers that did speak out. They even worked together with civil society organizations, and it ended up in court. Unfortunately, even that didn't help, and we still saw this tragedy unfold. And what we believe needs to happen is a shift in the thinking among managers, universities, society and politicians, that advocacy is a duty. It is a duty of the healthcare worker. It is not only a right to advocate, it is a duty to advocate. And confidentiality clauses in employment contracts that say you're not allowed to bring your employer into disrepute are invalid if this regards matters of life and death of your patients, because that is what is holding healthcare workers back. The thought that they are not actually allowed to speak out, and also the fear of victimization. And that is the other sad reality, that there is that risk of victimization, and it can be very subtle. It's not always that you're being dismissed, but it might be that you will be ignored in the workplace, or that your training opportunities or further career progression will be undermined. So yeah, there healthcare workers, what we say, also should try not to do it alone, but should take collective approaches, so that it's not only you that is putting your head on the block, so to say, but that you are collectively as a group find power in numbers and speak out collectively. And we as society, I believe, also have a role to play, that when healthcare workers speak out, that we stand by them, we support them, because ultimately we tend to look at it from a distance, and why did healthcare workers not do more? But healthcare workers are also human beings that have their own fears, but it's still not a sufficient excuse to step back and to let such injustices unfold.
And I guess it's also very frustrating the way in which we interface with health practitioners, because I'm frustrated. I go to the hospital. I mean, it's never a pleasant experience going to the hospital, you know, unless some sort of scheduled kind of routine, kind of minor. But even that, you know, there is an expectation of some discomfort when you go to a place where you source medical service, I guess, you know, extraction of a tooth, the ER especially, you know. So you interface with this person that you want speedy kind of response to your problem. Yeah. There's a queue. There's many other people. And you see this person as sort of a barrier. They're slow. You think they're slow. Yeah. You think they're lazy. They're these things. Also because you are frustrated yourself, you know. Yeah. Because you're there on some other urgent kind of, you know. Yeah. But really, I like what you're saying, that there is safety in numbers. And that's quite important, that we encourage that kind of enabling environment, you know, to speak out, but also the safe space to create that kind of discussion. But Marije, how do you think I think, you know, the kind of political change that needs to take place for this environment to thrive, this enabling environment to advocate, you know, and the safe space to be created. What do you think kind of the changes that need to be there politically, but also institutionally? What needs to happen? Yeah.
So there are internal arrangements and mechanisms that healthcare workers ought to be using to escalate concerns that they have, but often those arrangements are broken. So you have to first report the problem to your superior, and then it goes to the hospital CEO or the clinic or the facility manager, and then to the district. But it can easily be the chain can easily be broken. And we've known now those procedures don't really work. So I do think, look, when healthcare workers have tried all the internal mechanisms, they are allowed to go to external structures such as the Ombudsman, the Office of Health Standards Compliance. It's a government established institute, and or seek help elsewhere. But I also believe that it would be good for healthcare workers to have some kind of an confidential advisory body where they can discuss the challenges that they are facing in the workplace and get some advice on how to best address it. RHAP plays that function, but we are still a small organization. I think we need it on a larger scale. Of course, joining your local union is important because that helps you in creating the safety in numbers, and for the unions as well to focus as much on patient rights as on healthcare worker rights. I think the two, in most cases, can go together. That doesn't have to be opposing one another. So yeah, those are some of the arrangements. Politically, we would love to see the Minister of Health speaking out meaningfully to say, we expect healthcare workers to raise the alarm. We expect healthcare workers to advocate. If you do and you get victimized, here's my cell phone number, please call me and I will intervene. It has been said before by politicians, but it's not being implemented. And I believe that that's one of the discussions that we had, part of the discussions that we had last night. We should shift the thinking that advocacy can lead to victimization and punishment. Well, that's the truth, but we should change that situation that not advocating, not standing up should lead to, should have repercussions, should be misconduct, as we see now with Life is Sidimeni. So that healthcare workers and management is held accountable for not intervening. And if we can make that shift so that, and I think that makes it full circle, as I said earlier on, advocacy is a competency. We expect healthcare workers to speak out and to be protected when they do. And if it is now formally a duty and it would be negligent or misconduct if you do not speak out, then I think it would also provide more support to the healthcare worker to speak out.
I think that's quite an interesting approach in terms of, if you don't speak out, then you really... there's a problem there.
Yes.
But in terms of, and I know you touched this earlier on, in terms of, the role of academic institutions, where people get their training, what do you think in terms of, are we institutionalizing it? Are we creating activists? Are we saying that you can be an activist in the workspace, and people sometimes frown upon activism, but I mean, there's a way to interpret what activism is. And within, the healthcare space, be an activist, be an advocate. Do you think institutions of higher learning, within that space that train healthcare workers, are they saying we're affirming the right for you to be an activist within the space, within the workspace, as a healthcare practitioner? Because I mean, when you look at especially medical students, their frustrations, they're the first to come to university in the beginning of the year, or these kind of learning environments, and they just seem so frustrated. Study.
Yeah, no, it must be integrated into the training of all the health professionals training from day one. What we see now is there's some development of, we give some advocacy guest lectures in universities. It's like maybe the final year or so once off. It has to be, it's part of the competency of the healthcare workers. It can't be an add-on. It must be part of the training, reinforced during the practicals. It must be part of the exams. You cannot graduate if you've not passed your advocacy training as well. It's not. Yes, people think advocacy is political, it's something for activists, but if you've given your oath, if you know that you have to put patients first, you can't not be an activist. In the current situation where there are unfortunately so many challenges in the workplace, you have to be part of building the system and resolving those challenges. And there are ethical, legal ways of doing so. Even if you look at the Whistleblowing Act, the Protected Disclosure Act, any developments in the workplace that are putting the safety of patients at risk, you actually have a duty to report.
Healthcare workers
have, it's already there.
That's all the time we have. But thank you so much for coming through, and kudos to the wonderful work that you guys are doing. And you guys can find them on the internet if you just Google Rural Health Advocacy Project and just look at the work that they're doing and what you can do in order to contribute either financially, also maybe volunteer in some of the projects that they're doing. Visit and listen to the conversation that they're having around the space that they work in. Thank you so much for watching, and join us again in the next season in 2018. Have a good evening.